inconceivable. And he has this pronounced lisp, so it's more like inconceivable. And he says it over and over and over again. And he's hired this one particular guy named Inigo Montoya, who's a swordsman, and he's supposed to be kind of the cleanup man for Vizzini. And at some point in the movie, finally Inigo looks at Vizzini and he says, "You keep using that word, but I do not think it means what you think it means." And we do that a lot with the Bible, don't we? We keep using these verses and using these words and using these concepts. And maybe if we're really honest with ourselves, it doesn't mean what we think it means. Here's the danger we want to talk about today. When we interpret the Bible based solely on our personal framework, more times than not end up misapplying it and what it says in our own lives. And I'm going to give you an example of this from my own life. I'm sure you have your own, and I'm sure there are plenty in the Bible, but this was the one that came to mind for me. Most of you know that I grew up, I was born and raised a Southern Baptist. I graduated from the Southern Baptist Seminary. I was ordained in that particular denomination, and so people frequently ask me, "Why did you leave the Southern Baptist Church? Why are you pastoring in the Methodist Church today?" And what I tell them is, I didn't leave the Southern Baptists left me. And that happened the moment that my marriage ended. The Southern Baptists have had a rule in place since time immemorial that if you have gone through a divorce, whether you were for it or not, whether you initiated it or not, you become a divorced person the moment that happens. And you get this scarlet letter D imprinted on your chest, which makes you unqualified and unworthy not only to pastor a church, but also to serve in any leadership capacity in the church. You're not allowed to be an elder or a deacon or to serve on committees. You just become a damaged person for the rest of your life. And so I often get into these discussions with my fellow Methodist clergy about why that is. And it's basically based on two different scriptures that have been misinterpreted. That Southern Baptist, they said, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, you're out. Here they are. The first one is from Malachi. The prophet Malachi speaking for God. God says, "I hate divorce. To divorce your wife is to overwhelm her with cruelty. So guard your heart. Do not be unfaithful to your wife." That made perfect sense in Malachi's time if you think about it, because women had no rights in that culture. Women were married to men basically as a business transaction. If you wanted to marry a woman, you went to her family, you said, "I'm going to marry that one," and you worked out a price, and that price was paid, and that woman becomes your property, and her sole task is to bear you babies and take care of your household. And if she didn't fulfill those expectations up to your standards as a man, you could divorce your wife simply by saying 3 times aloud, "I divorce you," and she's out. And guess what? Now she has no money, no home, no rights, no hope. The only hope for a woman in that culture at that time, if her husband divorced her, was to find another husband, or to hope that she had adult sons who would take care of her. And if they didn't, they were consigned to poverty. They often had to prostitute themselves in order to survive. So God is saying in that time, I hate divorce because it exploits women. It treats them badly. It makes them property, and that breaks my heart. And that makes perfect sense. In today's culture, things are flip-flopped. About 80% of the divorces in our culture today are initiated by women. And guess who almost always loses their home? It's not the woman, it's the man. The man loses custody and time with his children. The man loses financial status and financial gain. So it's a different context, it's a different culture. It doesn't really apply. The second one is from the first letter to Timothy that Paul wrote. Paul's writing to this young pastor, and he's teaching him about the qualifications for a pastor in the church. And in 1 Timothy 3:3, he says a pastor, or in other translations, a bishop or an overseer, must be blameless. He must be the husband of one wife. And so the Southern Baptists take that to mean that, well, if you are divorced from your one wife, then you either are going to have multiple wives during the course of your lifetime, or you're going to have no wives. And either way, that's not acceptable. Again, think about the cultural context here. Paul is writing to Timothy, who's living in a culture where it was not uncommon to have multiple wives. And even if you just had one official wife, it was more than common for a man to be married to one woman and have several girlfriends on the side that he was setting up and providing households for and having children with. And so what Paul was saying to Timothy here was, men like that are not acceptable. You can't be a pastor if you have multiple wives and multiple families going on at the same time. So, here's what I want us to think about today. We need to read the Bible. We need to use the Bible as our standard for living, but we need to be smart about it. We tend to use the Bible as a club, that we beat people over the head. And we say, you're not living your life right. Whack. You need to shape up. Whack. You're disappointing God. Whack. God's disappointed in you. Whack. And then after we whack people over the head over and over and over again, we wonder, why nobody comes to church anymore? We need to be careful about how we use the Bible. So we're going to use the scripture today to look at 3 reasons that God gave us the Bible. And it's not to use it as a club. It is, number 1, to use it as a solid foundation for living. Number 2, to provide course corrections for His people throughout our lives. And finally, to produce people, faithful followers who live out their faith. So let's look at each of these. But before we do, we need to examine a very important key word in this passage. You heard Marvis read it. She said that all Scripture is inspired by God. And there's a lot of controversy in theological circles about what this means. First rule when we're trying to interpret what's going on in the Bible is we go back to the original language and we look and we see what did the original writer actually write in his language. The word that Paul uses here in the Greek is theopneustos. It's the conjunction of 2 different words that basically literally means God breathed. We also sometimes translate this to mean inspired. So what does it mean for God to inspire things? Second rule is we look and we see where else that word is used in Scripture. And in this case, we're out of luck. Because theopneustos is not used anywhere else in Scripture. And so then we try to go and we try to look in other non-biblical literature in that language where it might be used. And again, we're out of luck. The word theopneustos is not used in any other Greek literature. And so the last thing we do when we're trying to interpret Scripture is we look at that concept and we say, okay, where might this concept be elsewhere in the Scripture? Anybody tell me where else in the Bible the concept of God breathing is contained? In the beginning, God breathes life into Adam. He creates this thing out of the dust and the clay, and then He breathes life into it. God breathed life into Adam. And so what it tells us, what we're going to work from today is this idea that what Paul was telling Timothy is that the Scripture, the words contained in that Bible that you have in your home, gathering dust, or in the pew in front of you, or maybe that you do dig into each and every day, is something that God gave us because those words are designed to give us life. It's not designed to be a club. It's not designed to push people away or categorize people, but it's designed to infuse His life into His people. So, number 1 purpose is that we want to use it to lay a solid foundation for our lives. Paul writes to Timothy and he says, all Scripture is inspired by God. It's useful to teach us what is true and to make us realize what is wrong in our lives. Most of you will recognize the picture up there on the screen if you can see it. The Leaning Tower of Pisa. And I did a little bit of reading about this week as I was studying for this. And what I found was this was not built as a weird tourist attraction, believe it or not. If you travel through Italy, I'm told, as you go through the cities and the countryside, you'll see towers like this standing all over the place. And they originated because these large family groupings were always at war in Italy back hundreds of years ago. And so rather than building castles that went outward like they did in England, they would build these towers to defend themselves. And so the families would live up at the top of the tower, and they would have archers stationed around to drive people away or to pour boiling oil on people or whatever else they did. And so the Pisa family commissioned this tower to be built, and they started off, and apparently whoever they hired didn't really know what he was doing. The final completed tower is almost 200 feet tall, and the architect, the builder, decided that pouring a foundation that was only 9 feet tall or 9 feet deep was sufficient for a 200-foot tall tower. Also didn't look at the soil conditions and see if this was really firm enough to support a building of this size. And so gradually over the early years that this tower was erected, it began to lean. And today that 200-foot tower leans about 12 feet from its center. And thankfully it's stopped settling, stopped moving. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is a lot like our faith lives. We need a solid foundation for our lives. If we don't, we will crumble, we'll fall over, we will eventually be destroyed, but we also need plenty of time to mature. As I read, it was interesting to me that the tower, the only reason it didn't fall over very early on was that it was built over the course of 111 years. They started off and they built the first piece of it and it started to lean, and then the family got into a big war that lasted a number of years, and so they stopped building and just lived in it, and that gave that foundation time to settle and to readjust. And so when they finished building it, it was done settling, it was done leaning in that direction. How that applies to us is that we all have to learn how to follow Jesus. We all come into this world selfish. We all come into this world with this perspective that says, I just want what's in it for me. I want what I want. We say we love God, and maybe as little kids we really genuinely do, but everybody in this room can think of a time when, the first time in your life when God disappointed you, when something happened and you prayed and you said, God, please don't let that happen. God, please let this happen. And then it didn't go the way we wanted to. And so our hearts begin to struggle to follow Jesus. We begin to struggle to hang on to our faith. And so we have to learn how to follow God and to trust Him even when things don't go our way in particular. One of the ways that Paul tells Timothy that the Scripture helps us do that is it teaches us to listen to the right voice. Paul says that the Scripture teaches us what is true. The word here in the Greek literally means to educate. It means to train or to shape. Again, the importance of understanding the culture around this. Paul took this word from the Greek culture of the day. If you had a child, particularly a son in the Greek world, and you wanted to educate him, you had one of two options. You could send him to live with a tutor, and he would spend all day, every day with that tutor, being taught, being shaped, being molded into that tutor's way of thinking, that tutor's way of approaching the world. Or you could bring the tutor in to live with you in your home and do the same thing for your child. So the word he uses here describes that molding, that shaping process, that day in, day out, all day, every day exposure to a particular way of thinking. The other place that word was used in the culture was in Greek plays. Greek plays would have these interludes in them where there would be a chorus that would stand on stage, and there would be what was called a poet-director, which is what this word named in their culture. And that poet-director would be out of sight off of the stage and would call out instructions to the chorus, and they would sing back their response and would set the